How did a tiny island nation build the largest empire in history? The answer isn't just found in India, Africa, or the Americas. Surprisingly, the story begins much, much closer to home, on the green Isle of Ireland. This is the story of how Ireland became the unwilling blueprint for the British Empire. For centuries, England's relationship with Ireland was complex and often violent. But it wasn't until the 16th century, under the Tudor dynasty, that things really escalated. England was Protestant. Ireland was staunchly Catholic. This religious divide became the justification for a new, more aggressive form of colonization. The English didn't just want to rule Ireland. They wanted to remake it in their own image. This is where the idea of the plantation system was born. It sounds agricultural, but it was a social and political engineering project. The English crown confiscated vast tracts of land from Irish chieftains, especially in provinces like Ulster and Munster. They then planted these lands with loyal Protestant settlers from England and Scotland. These settlers weren't just farmers. They were a colonial garrison, tasked with holding the territory and imposing English law, language, and culture. Think about it. This was a systematic replacement of one population with another. The native Irish were pushed onto less fertile land. Their traditional social structures were dismantled, and their faith was suppressed. Harsh laws, known as the penal laws, were later introduced, barring Catholics from owning land, holding public office, or even getting a formal education. The goal was to create a permanent underclass, severing the Irish from their own heritage and power. This Irish experiment taught the English valuable, if brutal, lessons in empire building. They learned how to use legal frameworks to dispossess native populations. They perfected the strategy of divide and rule, pitting settlers against natives and creating a social hierarchy with the English at the top. They learned how to use religious and cultural differences as a tool for control. And they learned how to justify it all with a narrative of bringing civilization to a supposedly barbaric people. Now, fast forward to the 17th and 18th centuries. When English colonists crossed the Atlantic to North America, what model did they use? They used the Irish blueprint. They saw Native Americans through the same lens they had viewed the wild Irish. They used similar legal justifications to claim land, pushing indigenous tribes further and further west. Treaties were made and broken, and reservations became the American equivalent of the marginal lands the Irish were forced onto. The idea of replacing a native population with loyal settlers was a direct import from the Irish plantations. Look at India. The British East India Company, and later the British Raj, mastered the art of exploiting local divisions. They pitted princes against each other, just as they had used rival Irish clans. They established a ruling class of British administrators who lived separately from the Indian population, mirroring the fortified towns of the English settlers in Ireland. They imposed an English legal and educational system, believing it was superior, just as they had in Ireland. The justification was always the same: bringing order and progress to a supposedly chaotic land. The same patterns were repeated across the globe. In Africa, colonial powers drew arbitrary borders, lumping rival ethnic groups together and fueling future conflicts. In Australia and New Zealand, the indigenous Aboriginal and Maori peoples faced land confiscation and cultural suppression, echoing the plight of the Irish centuries earlier. The empire was built on a repeatable formula, and that formula was first tested and perfected just across the Irish Sea. The language used to describe the colonized was also remarkably consistent. The Irish were called savages living in a primitive society. Later, the same terms were applied to Native Americans, Africans, and other indigenous peoples. This dehumanizing language made it easier to justify conquest and exploitation. It framed colonization not as an act of aggression, but as a moral duty, the so-called white man's burden. But there's another side to this story. Because Ireland was the first colony, it also became one of the first centers of anti-colonial resistance. For centuries, The Irish fought back through rebellions, political movements, and a fierce determination to preserve their culture and identity. This long struggle for independence would later inspire other colonized nations around the world. Leaders from India to Africa looked to the Irish experience for lessons in resistance and nationalism. The Irish diaspora, scattered by famine and poverty products of the colonial system, carried these stories of struggle with them, fueling independence movements from afar. So when we look at the grand narrative of the British Empire, the rise and fall, the triumphs and the tragedies, we can't ignore its starting point. Ireland wasn't just a neighbor. It was a laboratory. It was the training ground where the tools, tactics, and ideologies of empire were forged. The policies of land confiscation, settler colonialism, cultural suppression, and legal discrimination that would define British rule for 300 years were all pioneered in Ireland. Understanding this history changes how we see the world. It shows us that empires aren't built overnight. They are built on precedents. The story of how Ireland became the blueprint for the British Empire is a powerful reminder of how ideas and actions, once tested, can shape the fate of millions across continents and centuries. It's a crucial and often overlooked chapter in the story of our modern world. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, please hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let us know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like to see covered. See you next time.